What's up? How's everybody doing? Everybody doing good? You guess. Tough crowd. Well, let's hope I can fix it up. Fix it up. It's been a minute since I've been back up here. I preached a message back in March, late March, a couple months ago. Feels like a week ago with how time is flowing with COVID. But preached about ministry, and hopefully you've seen it. If you didn't see it, it's on YouTube. It's on there. And Andrew asked me a couple weeks ago if I wanted to preach again, and I said sure. And that date was today. And this time I got to pick my message. Got to be a little bit more creative with it. And I wanted to pick something that I was hoping and was praying that it would build your faith, find something that you guys may struggle with, and something that would help you guys out. And when I preached about ministry last time I did the introduction, then I read the word. This time I'm going to read the word and then do the introduction. I'm going to flip it this time. We're going to be in Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. So if you got a Bible there, get there, swipe there, look there, listen there, whichever one. Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. And in this text, Jesus here, he's getting his disciples for the first time. He's getting his team for his ministry so he can go out and preach and heal people. And his ministry is first starting out now. He's already been baptized, which I thought was always ironic. He's been tempted by the devil in the desert. He's healing people already, left and right. He's making moves. He's doing his thing. But now he realizes that he needs his team. He needs people that will help him and people that he can train to do his will when he goes to heaven. So Luke 5, verses 1 through 11. Let's get to it. One day, as Jesus was preaching on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, great crowds pressed in on him to listen to the word of God. He noticed 2 empty boats at the water's edge, for the fishermen had left them there and were washing their nets. Stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push it out on the water. So he sat in the boat and taught the crowds from there. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Now go out where it's deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish." "Master," Simon replied, "we worked hard all last night and didn't catch a thing. But if you say so, I'll let the nets down again." And this time the nets were so full of fish they began to tear. A shout for help brought the partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. When Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus. "Oh Lord, please leave me, for I'm such a sinful man." For he was awestruck by the number of fish they had caught, as were the others with him. His partners, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also amazed. Jesus replied to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you'll be fishing for people." And as soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. So in this text, Jesus here, he's getting his team, he's getting his disciples, and Jesus finds Peter and James and John too. But the main guy we're going to be talking about today is Peter. And Peter, what I noticed about this text was that Peter was struggling, and what he was doing as becoming a fisherman. He was a fisherman, but he wasn't having the greatest of day. And so now what I noticed about this text is that Peter found his calling. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. I want to talk to you guys about finding your calling. And I wonder how many people in here are confused about the calling. You know, most of you guys have been, grew up in church. You love Jesus. I pray you love Jesus. You love people. You read the word. You're in community with believers. You go to church. But you're a little confused about your calling. You may be confused about your future, about which direction to take, and everything. And we throw this word calling out a lot in church, out of church, everywhere. And the word calling is thrown everywhere, but I think one of the reasons why it kind of starts for us is that question that we always ask growing up is, what do you want to be when you get older? And when you're young, you say the craziest things. Because we get asked when we're all the way back in elementary school, what do you want to be when you get older? You get asked that question, you say pro athlete, doctor, president, anything. You say anything. And there's nothing wrong with those answers, but over time, the question sort of changes. Because when you get my age, 19, or even when you get 18 and when you become a junior and senior, it's not even like, what do you want to be when you get older? It's more of like, are you going to college or are you going to the military? Like, what are you going to be doing? So the question changes over time. And there's nothing wrong with those answers that we give, but the thing about it is that answer usually follows us as we get older. And the answer that we give, we think that our calling or our dream for our life is to the answer besides to Jesus. And in this text here, Peter thought his calling was to become a fisherman. But when Jesus came into his life, he gave him a new calling. And the hardest part about chasing what you want for our life is usually if it's God's will or not, or if it's our plan, or if it's God's plan, or even if he's telling you to stop or to keep going. And so like for my dream growing up, I sort of told this a little bit about ministry, but I'm gonna talk about it again if I didn't, was to become a sportscaster, was to become work for ESPN, Fox Sports, and I thought that was my calling. I have this thing right here. I got this all the way back in elementary school. I don't know if you guys can see it. It says Future Sportscaster Award to me, Dylan Holbein. Carolina Panthers, Duke basketball, Carolina Hurricanes. I don't watch the Hurricanes much, but I guess I did at the time. One more team that's missing is the Auburn Tigers, football. Miss Davenport on June 8, 2007 gave me that. I don't know who that is anymore. I know Miss Davenport, but it's not her. But the dream that I had over mine, it changed over time. And when continuing to grow my relationship with Jesus, it continued to change. And he came in my heart and he changed my motives, my desires, and what I wanted. And at some point, I sort of felt like he was calling me to ministry in some way, and then maybe not, whichever. And now this message isn't like if God's calling you to full-time ministry, because not everyone's necessarily called to full-time ministry, but we are called to minister to others. And so I want to help you guys of how you're supposed to find your calling. And it can be tricky, and we can start to doubt ourselves, and we can start to doubt God in some way. And it's important to know, like, when finding your calling, we're never alone in the journey. We're all trying to make it. We're all trying to find our calling. And when we're trying to find our calling, and when we don't know our calling, what God does is he prepares us for our calling before we walk in it. And because when we don't know it, that's when our faith is being developed. And because our calling that God has for life, it's a huge responsibility. And so God's just making sure that we're ready to receive it, that we have the faith, and our faith is ready to receive it. So I'm going to give you guys 2 points, and my first point is your calling finds you. Your calling finds you. The beautiful thing about this text is that Jesus found Peter, and Peter's calling found him. That Peter's calling to be a disciple and to make disciples, it found him where he was. It found him when he was struggling as a fisherman. And so we often think to go look for our calling or to go look for our dream and our plan for our life. But in this text, we see Peter's calling finding him. Because Peter became a disciple, made disciples, and he trained and he learned from Jesus for 3 years, because that's how long his ministry was, and then he went out to advance the ministry and to keep it going for Jesus. And isn't this great news? Like, we don't have to find our calling, instead it finds us. Jesus finds us where we are when we're struggling, and God is preparing us for our calling. And I want to give you guys something. I know this may be so cliche, but while you're waiting for your calling, trust God's timing in the process of waiting. And waiting is a hard thing to do. But it's important to remember, like, our waiting season isn't our wasted season, because that's when God is working in us and even through us. And God is asking us to trust in him, trust in his timing, trust in our calling before we even walk in it. And trust in his plan before we even see it, before we walk in it. And our calling is not from people, it's not from culture, it's not from this world, it's from our Father in heaven who knows us and knows the real us. So we don't have to find our calling like Peter in this text, instead it finds us where we are. And we all have a different calling because God has different plans for all of us. And it's a little bit different between our calling as Christians and our job as Christians. Because, like, it amazes me when people say, what, as a Christian, like, what is my job as a Christian? But our job as Christians are to love our neighbor, to forgive like he does, pray and care for people, spread the gospel, read the word, learn about him, worship him. Like, that's our job as Christians. But our callings are different. And that's the dream, living for God and living for people to help people out. And we can walk in that every day. whether we know our calling or whether we don't know our calling. And another thing I noticed about this text with Peter is that Peter's calling found him at the most ordinary moment. You know, we often want God to work in our lives with the highlight reel moments, you know, like with the extraordinary moments, but God often works in the small details. Because Peter here, all he's doing is just, he's struggling fishing, and as Jesus comes, he's just washing his nets. It's just an everyday moment in Peter's life. It's just an everyday encounter that he goes through, everyday process that he goes through throughout his day. But then here comes Jesus. Because Peter's struggling, Peter's disappointed, he's frustrated, he's stressed, he needs hope. And then here comes Jesus, the source of hope, giving him his calling. And Jesus, in this text, he just got done preaching on the shore of Galilee, and the crowds are getting bigger. He's famous at this point. His ministry is going. It's just getting started. So he's kind of tired, but he can't stop because this is what he came to do. And so he sees Peter, and he's like, I need you now. I need you to help me out so we can keep this ministry going alive, and so he can make disciples. Because this is what Jesus came to do. And the people didn't want him to stop. They needed him. So what did he do? He needed someone to help him. He found 2 boats in verse 2. And Peter and the others left them there to wash the boats. And in verse 3, now this right here kind of shocked me. And verse 3 is what Jesus did. Stepping into one of the boats, Jesus asked Simon, its owner, to push it out in the water. So he sat in the boat and taught the crowds from there. Like Jesus didn't even ask to even get in the boat. He just sat in the boat and just said, I need to use your boat. So he asked him to put it out in the water a little bit deeper. That isn't normal for us. Usually when we want to borrow something, we have to ask it. But Jesus here just does it, and he needs Peter. And that one moment is what changed everything for Peter. So Jesus used his boat, and after he called him to be a disciple, and his life changed forever. He went from living an average life to a purposeful life. Peter went from living a life for himself to living a life for people, and to living a life to know Jesus and to learn about Jesus, and even learn about himself a little bit and how he can change. And so in this text, we see Peter struggling, and he's disappointed, frustrated. He didn't catch a fish all day, and here comes Jesus. And in verse 6 and 7, it says, and this time the nets were so full of fish they began to tear. A shout for help brought their partners in the other boat, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. Now, verse 8 is when like Peter realizes who Jesus is. He realizes that his calling is now from Jesus. He realizes that he has to say yes to Jesus. It says, when Simon Peter realized what had happened, he fell to his knees before Jesus and said, "Oh Lord, please leave me from such a sinful man." For he was awestruck by the number of fish that they had caught. And it's because now Peter is playing this game as like he knows who he is, but then he realizes who he is in himself. Peter realizes, like, I'm a pro fisherman. I didn't catch a fish all day. And then, Jesus comes. Both of the boats are filled with fish, and the nets begin to tear. So now Peter's coming to playing the blame game against himself, or calling himself worthless. But then he realizes who Jesus is. He's like, I got to follow you now. Like, I know who you are. You are the Messiah who people were talking about. And now he sees himself as somebody he has to follow. Have any of y'all ever felt like that? Like the glory of God is too much to take in sometimes? Like it overwhelms you a little bit, in a good way though. Like it gets you awestruck, it gets you speechless a little bit. And one of the reasons why Peter followed Jesus is because he realized that moment was a blessing to him. So like the calling that God has on your life and who he is, it's a blessing. It's a blessing to walk in it. It's a blessing to be in a relationship with him. Like Peter's blessing wasn't just the fish that Jesus gave him, because he was a fisherman, he needed some fish. But his blessing was the calling that Jesus had for his life that changed his life forever. So Peter Peter walked in his blessing because he said one thing. He said yes. And that right there is my second point. Say yes to following Jesus. Say yes to follow Jesus. See, if we're being honest, we kind of like this part. Like in church, it's cool to say yes to Jesus. It's cool to be cool to be on the boat for Jesus. It's cool to be on fire for him. But when we leave here, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different because our faith gets tested. Our faith gets challenged with life, with people. So say yes to following Jesus. Say yes to follow him throughout the week. How is your faith throughout the week as you go? And following Jesus for us as Christians should be the goal. It should be our go-to, should be our only way. Hey, 2020 has been a wild year, so by this time it should be normal by now. I mean, it should be a little bit normal by him. Following him should be our go-to. We should desire to learn about him through his word, through people who speak through him. And so we should learn to learn about him. And so Peter in this text, he became a disciple because he followed Jesus. He said yes to following Jesus. And in Luke 5:11 is what really caught my eye. It's the last verse. It says, as soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. Now I keep talking about Peter, but in verse 11 it says they. So they means multiple. So the verse ahead, or 2 verses ahead, it says James and John. See, the blessing that Jesus had for him and the calling that Jesus had for Peter, it was so much that James and John had to come up. So the calling that you have from God, it's so big that other people have to come to Jesus too. Like the calling on your life will bring others to Jesus too. It would take others along on the journey. And here's the thing that I really want to touch on verse 11. As soon as they landed, they left everything and followed Jesus. Peter left what he knew as fishing. He left what he knew as his way of living. He left his way of thinking, his heart. He left everything to follow Jesus. And one of the things that Peter left was his plan for his life and his comfort zone. See, this right here is another thing that we kind of struggle with. Like we as Christians, or as people in general, we struggle with living out of our comfort zone. But Peter, to walk in his calling and to obey what Jesus had for him, he had to say no to his comfort and say yes to the discomfort. So when finding your calling and when Jesus comes to your life, your calling will never be in your comfort zone. What God has for you will never be in comfort zone. Guys, I don't know if you guys can tell, but I am not comfortable up here. But I felt like God called me to do this. And I know some of my family even are watching, and they'll tell you, during family gatherings, I don't talk much. I'm laid back. David knows it too. I'm laid back a little bit. But it's really important as Christians and as to do what God has called us to do, as to what God has called us to do, to walk out of our comfort zone, to follow Jesus, to say yes to him, to walk in our calling. And when you do that and we say yes to Jesus, you're walking in your calling and you're walking in a place of satisfaction with Jesus because all of your yes. And what's crazy about this story is, and I don't even think Peter even realized this, he took a leap of faith, but I don't even think he even realized it. Because at the time he didn't know Jesus. So he took a leap of faith to follow Jesus. He said yes to Jesus without knowing what it meant. I don't think Peter knew what the next 3 years meant when he said yes to following Jesus on the boat. There's no way he knew that the next 3 years of his life he would have been in ministry with Jesus and advancing the gospel and preaching and going on. There's no way. And you never know what God has planned with your one yes to him. You never know what God has planned with your one small act of obedience, with your one answer to the call, to the plan that God has for you. And Jesus didn't just change Peter's life by what he did from fisherman to disciple and to living for himself, not for living people. He changed him from the inside. He changed his desires. He changed his motives. He changed his heart. He changed everything on him from the inside. He changed his passion from fishing for people. That verse always confused me, like fishing for people. He could have worded that a little bit different, but fishing for people, interesting verse. And if you really want to know of how you're following Jesus, of how you're making steps in your relationship with Jesus, if he changes you from the inside. And maybe you struggle with that, so maybe just go to him in prayer and just ask him to change how you think, how you act, because it all starts with our mind. And there's a verse about renewing our mind, and being transformed by our mind. And because when we're changed on the inside, that's how our faith is progressing. That right there is how our faith is making steps with our relationship with him. So following Jesus is our first calling. And when we start to follow Jesus, everything else follows him because he leads the way. And I used to think that my calling, my dream was to become a sportscaster or to any position any position that I chase after, anything like that. And you guys may be like that too. You guys may think that my calling for my life, or what God has called me to, is to do this or to chase after that. But our first calling is to Jesus. Because when he is our first calling, he leads the way and he reveals things to you. And it is to every day walk with the Lord in what we do and what he has planned for you. It's an everyday walk. It's a walk, though. It's not a race. And when you follow him, everything flows together in him because it's out of our will. It's not in his will anymore. And so I want to help you guys out in just being obedient and be active in your faith. When you're walking with him, you're walking in your first calling. We overcomplicate it sometimes because, culture says, if you chase after that, then you get what you satisfy for. But when you chase after Jesus, as Christians, that's what we get. Because Jesus calls him the filler of life. It's the filler of our soul. He satisfies us within. So I want to leave you guys off with just say yes to following Jesus. Sit in his presence. Walk with him. Learn with him. Follow him. Will it be easy? Not at all. He would challenge you. He would test you. He would test your faith, your belief, but it's worth it. And maybe you don't know the direction that God's taking you. Maybe you don't know your calling. Just like Peter in this text at one time, just know you don't have to find it. Instead, it finds you. Jesus has what we need, what we chase after. And when we are obedient to him, he gives us what we need, because oftentimes in life we chase after what we want, but Jesus chases after what we need. And we need a fix sometimes within ourselves, and not just all the time on our outward appearance. So follow him, let him lead the way, and deny yourself. That sounds a little bit intense, but just deny your way of living, your way of thinking for a new life, a new mind, a new soul. So say yes to following him and get to that place of surrender. Because I don't know about you, I get a little tired of myself, so I need him. I'm scared not to have him. And so I pray that we get to that place of surrender to let him take a hold of our life. So he is our first calling, and when he is our first calling, everything flows together in him. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this message that you have laid on my heart, and I pray that it has impacted somebody today, that is bringing them closer to you, and you call yourself the filler of life and everything that we need in this life that we live. I pray that when we leave here, that our faith is being charged up, and throughout the week that we continue to build our faith, continue to build our relationship with you. I pray that we know that our calling is to you, and then after that you give us what you have called us to do in this world. And I thank everyone in this room that you have placed in here and all the work that you've done in their life and who they are. And in Jesus' name, amen.
All right.